The world never remembers the ones it throws away, until fate brings them back. The words echoed through Emily Carter's mind as the last of the pack members disappeared into the warm glow of the lodge, leaving her alone beneath the fading crimson light of the blood moon. Only an hour earlier, she had stood in the center of the sacred clearing, her heart trembling with the fragile hope every young Omega carried. She had imagined that perhaps tonight would finally be different, that someone might see beyond the whispered rumors, beyond the quiet nature everyone mistook for weakness. Instead, silence answered her. Then came the rejection. It was not shouted, nor delivered with cruelty loud enough for the forest to hear. Somehow that made it hurt even more. A few calm words, spoken before witnesses, had been enough to erase every dream she had carried since childhood. The ceremony ended, conversations resumed, laughter returned, and life continued for everyone except the forgotten Omega standing alone beneath the ancient pines. Emily lowered her eyes and quietly stepped away before anyone could offer the pity she dreaded more than loneliness itself. The gravel path stretched nearly 2 miles through towering evergreens toward the abandoned cabin that had belonged to her late grandmother. Every step carried her farther from the only home she had ever known. The evening air smelled of damp pine needles and distant rain. Wind stirred the branches overhead, whispering through the forest like voices that had forgotten human language centuries ago. She pulled her worn gray cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the ache pressing against her chest. Tears threatened to fall, but she refused to let them. She had spent too many years crying where no one cared to notice. Tonight, she would simply keep walking. The deeper she traveled into the woods, the quieter the world became. Even the usual songs of birds had faded. Only the slow rustle of leaves remained, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Emily paused. Something felt different. Wolves understood the language of nature long before they understood words, and although her own wolf had always been unusually quiet, instinct still lingered somewhere deep inside her. She listened carefully. At first there was nothing. Then it came again. A faint sound drifted through the trees. Not a growl, not a howl. A low, weary whimper carried by the wind. Emily frowned. Every lesson she had ever been taught warned her to turn around. Injured predators were unpredictable. The northern forest belonged to rogues, wild creatures, and things that rarely welcomed strangers. She took one cautious step backward. The sound came again, softer this time, almost disappearing beneath the whispering branches. Her heartbeat quickened. Whoever, or whatever, made that sound was alone. The realization settled over her with surprising weight. Alone. The same word that now described her. She closed her eyes for only a moment. She could leave. No one would blame her. No one would ever know she had heard it. She could return to the cabin, lock the door, and spend the night pretending the forest had remained silent. But that was never who Emily Carter had been. Even after everything the pack had taken from her, kindness remained the one thing no one had managed to steal. Taking a slow breath, she turned toward the sound instead of away from it. Branches brushed against her sleeves as she stepped off the trail and into the untouched forest where moonlight barely reached the ground. Moss softened each footstep, while fallen logs forced her to climb carefully over them. Another whimper guided her farther between the ancient trees until the scent reached her first. Rain, pine, and beneath both, the unmistakable scent of wolf. Fresh, powerful, yet fading. Emily's pulse raced as she rounded a cluster of massive boulders. There, lying beneath the shelter of a broken cedar, rested the largest black wolf she had ever seen. His coat, though dulled by rain and exhaustion, shimmered faintly beneath the moonlight. One amber eye slowly opened to meet hers. It held neither panic nor rage, only unbearable exhaustion, and something strangely familiar that made Emily forget to breathe. Emily remained perfectly still, afraid that even the sound of her breathing might frighten the enormous wolf lying beneath. The broken cedar. The amber eye watched her without blinking, calm but alert, carrying an intelligence that unsettled her in ways she could not explain. She had seen wolves all her life. She understood the cautious rhythm of wild creatures, the warning signs before they fled or defended themselves. This felt different. It was almost as though someone was quietly studying her from behind those golden eyes. The evening breeze shifted, carrying the scent of rain, pine sap, and damp earth. Beneath it lingered the unmistakable smell of silverwood resin, a substance hunters often coated on their arrows because wolves instinctively avoided it. Emily slowly lowered herself to one knee, keeping her hands visible. "It is all right," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling branches overhead. "I am not going to hurt you." The wolf did not move. His breathing remained slow, though noticeably strained, and only then did Emily notice the deep scratches crossing his thick black fur. They were not bleeding heavily, but they looked painful enough that every breath appeared to require effort. Leaves clung to his coat where he had apparently collapsed among the roots after traveling much farther than his strength should have allowed. Emily carefully opened the small leather satchel she always carried. Inside were simple supplies collected over years of helping elderly neighbors and injured woodland animals. Clean cloth, dried yarrow, willow bark, a tiny jar of pine salve prepared from her grandmother's old recipe. None of it was remarkable, yet she never traveled without it. She hesitated for one last moment. Every lesson she had ever learned warned that approaching an injured wolf could end badly. Still, something deeper than fear urged her forward. She reached out slowly until her fingertips hovered inches from the dark fur covering his shoulder. The wolf watched her carefully. Then, almost unbelievably, he lowered his massive head onto the moss as though granting permission. Emily released the breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she murmured. Her fingers brushed gently through the thick coat, searching carefully until she found several splinters of dark wood and traces of silverwood resin tangled between the fur. She removed each one with steady patience, apologizing softly every time the wolf flinched. "I know," she whispered. "I know this hurts. We are almost finished." Minutes passed unnoticed beneath the growing darkness. Fireflies drifted between the trees like floating stars while the first drops of rain began tapping gently against the cedar branches overhead. Emily cleaned every wound she could reach before applying a thin layer of pine salve. As she worked, the wolf never once growled. Instead, his amber eyes gradually softened, following every careful movement she made. It had been years since anyone had looked at her without judgment. The thought caught her by surprise. She smiled faintly despite herself. "Looks like we both had a difficult day," she said with a tired laugh. "Maybe tomorrow will be kinder to both of us." A distant horn suddenly echoed through the forest. Emily froze. Another followed only seconds later, closer this time. Search parties. She recognized the signal immediately. Hunters rarely entered the northern woods after sunset unless they were tracking something important. Voices drifted between the trees, too far away to understand, but close enough to send birds fluttering into the evening sky. The wolf's ears lifted instantly. His calm expression disappeared, replaced by sharp focus. He tried to stand, but his front legs trembled beneath his weight before he slowly settled back onto the forest floor. Emily looked toward the distant voices, then back at the exhausted animal beside her. If the hunters found him now, they would not stop to ask questions. They would see only an enormous wolf hidden deep inside forbidden woods. She made her decision before fear had the chance to argue otherwise. "Come with me," she whispered urgently. "My grandmother's cabin is less than half a mile from here. Nobody goes there anymore." The wolf watched her for a long second. Then, gathering what little strength remained, he slowly rose to his feet. Towering over her, he seemed almost unreal beneath the silver moonlight, powerful even in exhaustion. Emily turned toward the narrow trail leading through the trees, trusting that somehow this impossible stranger would follow. Behind her, she heard the quiet sound of heavy paws moving across the damp forest floor as the rain began to fall in earnest, washing away the tracks they left behind. The narrow trail wound through towering pines that swayed gently beneath the steady rain, and Emily resisted the urge to look back every few steps. Even without turning around, she could hear the slow rhythm of heavy paws following several feet behind her. The great black wolf never rushed, never stumbled, but each careful step carried the weight of exhaustion. Moonlight filtered through the clouds only occasionally, revealing his massive silhouette before darkness swallowed it again. Emily tightened her grip on the lantern she had taken from her grandmother's old storage shed weeks before. Its warm glow painted golden circles across the wet forest floor, guiding them through roots, fallen branches, and patches of slick moss. At last, the familiar outline of the cabin appeared between the trees. Time had weathered the small wooden home, but sturdy stone walls still protected it from the harsh northern winters. Ivy climbed one side of the chimney, while a narrow porch overlooked a quiet meadow that had long since returned to nature. Few members of the pack even remembered this place existed. Emily climbed the porch steps and carefully pushed open the creaking front door. The scent of cedar and dried herbs greeted her immediately, carrying memories of evenings spent beside her grandmother while old stories filled the room. She quickly lit 2 oil lamps, their soft light chasing away the shadows. Turning back toward the doorway, she found the wolf still standing outside beneath the rain. He watched the cabin without moving, as though uncertain whether he belonged inside. Emily offered the faintest smile. "You do not have to be afraid," she said quietly. "It is only an old house, but it is warm." For another long moment, he remained perfectly still. Then, with surprising gentleness for such an enormous creature, he climbed the wooden steps and crossed the threshold. Water dripped from his dark coat onto the worn floorboards, while Emily hurried to place old blankets beside the stone fireplace. Soon dry wood crackled softly as orange flames spread through the hearth, filling the room with welcome warmth. The wolf settled onto the blankets without protest, stretching out with an exhausted sigh that sounded almost human. Emily knelt beside a nearby cabinet and searched through boxes her grandmother had carefully labeled years before. Bundles of lavender, dried chamomile, clean linen, small jars of homemade remedies. Everything remained exactly where she remembered. She prepared warm water over the fire before returning to the wolf's side. This time he watched her with complete trust, allowing her to clean away the last traces of mud and silverwood resin hidden beneath his thick fur. As the hours passed, Emily noticed details she had overlooked in the forest. His coat shimmered with faint silver strands beneath the firelight. Around his neck rested no collar, no mark of any known pack. Yet there was an unmistakable dignity in the way he carried himself even while injured. He looked less like a wandering animal and more like a guardian from one of her grandmother's forgotten legends. Outside, the wind suddenly carried distant voices across the valley. Emily froze, setting the cloth aside. More horns echoed through the trees, followed by the unmistakable sound of horses moving along the northern ridge. Lanterns flickered between the trunks far beyond the meadow. Someone was searching throughout the forest. She quietly stepped toward the small window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. Riders wearing dark cloaks moved carefully between the trees, their lights sweeping across the landscape before disappearing again into the rain. Emily's heartbeat quickened. They were far more organized than ordinary hunters. Whoever they sought mattered enough to search through the night. She glanced back toward the wolf resting before the fire. His amber eyes had opened again, fixed not on the window but on her. There was no panic in them, only calm determination, as though he already understood exactly who waited beyond the forest. Emily slowly lowered the curtain. "No one is taking you anywhere tonight," she whispered with quiet certainty. "You are safe here." The wolf lowered his head once more, and for the first time since she had found him beneath the broken cedar, he closed his eyes completely, trusting the forgotten Omega with a peace he had not found anywhere else. Morning arrived wrapped in pale silver mist that drifted quietly across the meadow outside the cabin. Emily awoke before sunrise, just as she always had, listening to the familiar sounds of wind brushing through the pines and rainwater dripping from the roof. For a brief moment, she forgot she was no longer alone. Then she looked toward the fireplace. The great black wolf still rested on the blankets beside the fading embers, though something had changed. His breathing had become steadier during the night, and the strain that had clouded his expression seemed noticeably lighter. Emily smiled to herself before quietly adding fresh logs to the fire. Warm light slowly filled the cabin while she prepared a simple breakfast of oat porridge and herbal tea. She doubted the wolf would have any interest in either, yet the comforting routine helped settle her thoughts. Outside, the forest seemed peaceful once again, almost as though the searchers had never passed through. She carried a wooden bucket to the nearby spring, collecting fresh water before returning to the cabin with herbs she recognized growing beneath the old cedar trees. Her grandmother had spent years teaching her which leaves eased fever, which flowers soothed pain, and which roots restored strength. Most people in the pack dismissed those lessons as ordinary village knowledge. Emily had treasured every one of them. Back inside, she mixed crushed herbs into warm water before kneeling beside the wolf once again. He opened his amber eyes as she approached, watching every movement with quiet patience. "Good morning," she whispered with a gentle smile. "I hope today feels a little easier." Carefully, she removed the old bandages she had fashioned from clean linen the night before. She paused in surprise. The scratches had already begun closing far faster than she expected. Even the swelling around the deepest injuries had faded. "That is remarkable," she murmured softly. "You must be much stronger than you look." As she rinsed the remaining wounds, an unusual warmth spread through her fingertips. It began so gently she almost ignored it, like sunlight touching chilled skin after a long winter morning. The sensation flowed through her hands into the cloth resting against the wolf's shoulder. Tiny strands of pale golden light shimmered for only an instant before disappearing beneath his dark fur. Emily blinked, convinced she had imagined it. She pulled her hands back immediately, staring at them in confusion. Nothing looked different. Her fingers were steady. Her palms were empty. Yet when she looked back at the wolf, another change had taken place. He lifted himself more easily than before, standing without the hesitation that had marked every movement since she found him. He took several slow steps across the cabin, testing his strength, then turned toward her. Gratitude shone unmistakably in his steady gaze. Emily's heart began beating faster. Her grandmother's stories returned with startling clarity. There had once been healers whose gifts awakened only when they placed another life before their own. Most believed those tales belonged to another age, little more than comforting legends told beside fireplaces. Emily had never truly believed them herself. Now she was no longer certain. Before she could gather her thoughts, a sharp knock echoed against the front door. She froze. No one visited this cabin. Another knock followed, firmer this time. The wolf instantly became alert, stepping silently into the deeper shadows near the stone chimney where the firelight barely reached. Emily drew a slow breath and walked carefully toward the entrance. Through the narrow window, she spotted an elderly traveling merchant leading a tired mule loaded with supplies. Relief softened her shoulders. She recognized him immediately. Mr. Thomas Green occasionally passed through the northern trails trading flour, lantern oil, blankets, and medicine between scattered settlements. He had always treated Emily with simple kindness. Opening the door only halfway, she offered him a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Green." The old man tipped his weathered hat. "Morning, Miss Carter. I did not expect anyone to still be living out here." His eyes drifted briefly toward the quiet cabin before returning to her face. "There has been quite a stir across the northern territories. Riders have been searching every road since yesterday. They say someone very important disappeared during the storm." Emily felt her pulse quicken, though she kept her expression calm. "Did they say who?" Mr. Green slowly shook his head. "No names. Only that whoever they are, half the kingdom seems determined to find them before sunset." Emily glanced almost instinctively toward the silent corner where the great black wolf remained hidden from sight. She did not know why fate had brought him to her doorstep, nor why strangers were searching the forest so desperately. But as the morning light spilled across the old cabin floor, one certainty quietly settled inside her heart. Whatever secret this mysterious wolf carried, it was far greater than either of them had yet imagined. The rest of the morning passed beneath a sky washed clean by the night rain, yet an uneasy feeling lingered over the little cabin hidden among the pines. Emily tried to focus on ordinary tasks, sweeping the wooden floor, hanging damp blankets outside to dry, and gathering fresh herbs from the edge of the meadow. Each familiar chore reminded her that life had once been simple, even if it had often been lonely. Now every quiet moment carried the awareness that an extraordinary secret rested only a few feet away inside her home. When she stepped back through the front door with a bundle of lavender in her arms, she stopped so suddenly that several stems slipped from her grasp. The blankets beside the fireplace were empty. For one frightened heartbeat, she believed the wolf had slipped away into the forest without a sound. Then she noticed the back door, standing slightly open. She hurried outside and found him standing at the edge of the clearing, gazing toward the distant mountain range where morning sunlight touched the highest peaks. His posture looked stronger than it had the day before. The injuries that had left him, barely able to walk now, seemed little more than fading reminders of the storm. Emily approached slowly until she stood only a few feet away. "You should not be standing for so long," she said gently. "You still need time to recover." The great wolf turned toward her. His amber eyes held that same impossible intelligence she had noticed from the very beginning. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then a warm breeze swept across the meadow, stirring the tall grass and carrying silver leaves through the air. The light around them seemed to brighten unexpectedly. Emily blinked as the wolf closed his eyes. A faint glow shimmered around his dark form, gentle as morning mist reflecting sunlight. The air itself felt strangely still. Emily instinctively stepped back, her heart pounding with confusion rather than fear. The light slowly faded. Standing where the wolf had been only moments earlier was a tall man with dark hair falling to his shoulders and silver eyes that reflected the morning sky. He wore simple clothing that looked worn from long travel, though somehow it fit him as though it had always belonged to him. His expression remained calm, almost cautious, as though he expected her to run. Emily could only stare. Every story she had ever heard about ancient wolves capable of taking human form suddenly became real before her eyes. The stranger lowered his head respectfully. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Thank you for choosing compassion when you had every reason to walk away." Emily searched for words, but found none. "You?" she whispered at last. "You were?" He nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled between them while birds sang from the surrounding trees as though nothing remarkable had happened. Finally, Emily managed a small, uncertain smile. "I suppose that explains why you healed so quickly." A faint smile touched his face in return. "Not entirely. Your care accomplished more than you realize." Emily felt warmth rise to her cheeks and quickly looked away. "What is your name?" she asked. The man hesitated almost imperceptibly before answering. "Ethan." He offered nothing more. No family name. No explanation. Only a single word. That sounded carefully chosen. Emily accepted it without pressing further. Everyone carried burdens they were not ready to share. "I am Emily," she replied. "Emily Carter." Ethan inclined his head. "It is an honor to meet you properly, Emily." They returned together to the cabin where Emily prepared another pot of herbal tea, while Ethan quietly observed the shelves filled with dried plants, old books, and handmade remedies. His eyes paused on a faded family portrait resting above the fireplace. "You live here alone?" he asked. Emily nodded. "My grandmother raised me here. After she passed away, I kept the cabin. Most people forgot it even existed." Ethan looked around thoughtfully. Sometimes forgotten places become the safest ones. Before Emily could respond, the peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant sound of galloping horses echoing through the valley. Both of them turned instinctively toward the window. Several riders crossed a ridge nearly half a mile away, their banners catching the sunlight. Even from that distance, they moved with disciplined precision, searching every trail and every abandoned structure they passed. Ethan's expression became unreadable. Emily noticed the change immediately. Whoever those riders were, they were not strangers to him. Yet instead of asking questions, she quietly closed the curtains and placed a warm cup of tea on the table beside him. "You can stay until you are ready," she said softly. Ethan looked at her with quiet surprise. In all his years surrounded by power, strategy, and endless expectations, no one had offered him something so simple without asking for anything in return. Outside, the search continued across the northern forests, while inside the forgotten cabin, a bond built on trust began to grow stronger with every passing hour. By late afternoon, golden sunlight stretched across the meadow, turning every blade of grass into strands of shimmering light. Yet the peaceful scene outside the cabin could not quiet the questions growing inside Emily's heart. Ethan spoke little about himself, but everything he did hinted at a life far different from the simple world she had always known. Even the way he moved across the room carried quiet confidence, despite having only recently recovered from his injuries. He repaired a loose hinge on the front gate with practiced hands, gathered firewood without being asked, and somehow noticed every detail around him before anyone else did. It was as though protecting others had become second nature long before he had arrived at her doorstep. Emily watched him from the kitchen window while preparing fresh bread. More than once she caught herself wondering who he truly was. But every time curiosity rose, She remembered how often people had judged her before learning anything about her. She refused to make the same mistake. Ethan returned carrying an armful of split logs and offered a grateful smile as she placed warm bread and vegetable soup on the small wooden table. "You have done enough for me already," he said quietly. Emily shook her head. "My grandmother used to say that kindness grows only when it is shared." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, as though those simple words carried far greater meaning than she realized. Before either of them could speak again, the peaceful silence was interrupted by distant voices drifting across the forest. This time they were closer than before. Emily quietly moved toward the front window and parted the curtain just enough to look outside. 3 riders had stopped near the old stone bridge less than a quarter of a mile from the cabin. Their horses wore polished leather tack, and each rider carried the silver crest of the Royal Guard embroidered across a dark traveling cloak. They spoke briefly before separating to search different trails leading through the northern woods. Ethan stepped beside the window without making a sound. The calm expression he had worn all day disappeared. His silver eyes followed the riders with careful attention, though not with fear. Emily noticed something else as well. One of the guards paused unexpectedly, looked toward the cabin from the distant trail, and rested a hand across his chest in a respectful gesture before continuing his search elsewhere. It lasted only a second, but Ethan had seen it too. He slowly stepped away from the window. "They are disciplined," Emily whispered. "They are not ordinary hunters." Ethan nodded once. "No, they are looking for someone they believe is important." Emily studied him carefully. "Do they know you?" He remained silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. "Some of them would." It was not a complete answer, but it was an honest one. Emily accepted it without pressing further. As evening settled over the forest, they carried 2 chairs onto the small porch overlooking the meadow. The breeze smelled of pine and fresh rain while crickets began their nightly chorus beneath the darkening sky. For the first time in many years, Emily found herself sharing quiet conversation with someone who listened without judgment. They spoke about forests, old stories, changing seasons, and the stars that slowly appeared overhead. Ethan listened with genuine interest as she described the herbal remedies her grandmother had taught her to prepare. "You underestimate yourself," he said softly after a thoughtful silence. Emily laughed gently. "The pack has spent years reminding me that I am nothing special." Ethan looked toward the horizon where the last light of day faded beyond the mountains. Sometimes the world mistakes gentleness for weakness because it has forgotten how much strength it takes to remain kind. Emily felt those words settle deeply inside her heart. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Just then, a large hawk circled above the meadow before gliding toward the porch railing. Instead of behaving like a wild bird, it landed calmly only a few feet from Ethan. Around one slender leg was tied a narrow strip of blue cloth bearing a silver emblem. Ethan quietly untied the message while the bird remained perfectly still. His eyes scanned the short note only once before he folded it carefully into his pocket. Emily noticed the concern that briefly crossed his face. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the forest where twilight shadows stretched between the trees. "The people searching these woods are running out of time," he answered quietly. "By tomorrow morning, they will begin searching every cabin, every abandoned shelter, and every hidden trail." Emily turned toward the familiar forest she had known since childhood. For the first time, the place that had always made her feel safe seemed suddenly very small. Yet as she looked back at Ethan, she realized her decision had already been made. Whatever danger waited beyond those trees, she would not abandon the man whose life had become unexpectedly intertwined with her own. The first light of dawn had barely reached the tops of the northern pines when the quiet rhythm of the forest changed. Emily noticed it before she saw anyone. The birds that usually greeted the morning had fallen silent, and even the breeze seemed to hesitate as though the woods themselves were listening. She stepped onto the porch with a basket in her hands and looked toward the narrow trail leading into the valley. A line of riders emerged through the morning mist, their silver cloaks catching the rising sunlight. Unlike the patrols from the day before, these men moved with unmistakable purpose. They were no longer searching at random. They were coming directly toward the cabin. Emily's heart tightened as she turned back inside. Ethan already stood near the window. His calm expression revealed neither surprise nor fear, only quiet acceptance. He had expected this moment to arrive. "They found us," Emily whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "Sooner than I hoped." She looked from the approaching riders back to him. "You should leave through the back trail. The forest is still thick enough to hide you." Ethan remained where he was. "If I leave now, they will continue searching. They will question everyone they meet, including you." Emily drew a slow breath. "I do not care what happens to me." Those words settled between them with unexpected weight. Ethan studied her face carefully, searching for hesitation, but found none. The rejected Omega, who had once believed she had nothing left to offer the world, now stood before him with quiet courage that asked for no reward. Before either of them could speak again, a firm knock echoed across the cabin. Emily walked to the door and opened it. Standing outside were 6 members of the Royal Guard, wearing polished silver crests across their dark uniforms. Their captain stepped forward with respectful composure. "Forgive the early visit," he said. "We are searching every residence in the Northern Territories." Emily answered honestly. "There is only me living here." The captain's eyes moved briefly past her shoulder toward the warm cabin beyond. Before he could ask another question, Ethan stepped forward into the doorway. Silence followed. The captain stared for only a heartbeat before his expression changed completely. Without speaking, he placed one hand across his chest and lowered himself onto one knee. Every guard behind him immediately did the same. None of them looked surprised to see Ethan. Instead, relief spread across their faces as though an impossible burden had finally been lifted. Emily stood motionless, unable to understand what she was witnessing. The captain lowered his head respectfully. "Your Majesty," he said in a steady voice, "the kingdom has been searching for you since the storm." Emily slowly turned toward Ethan. Her thoughts raced through every conversation they had shared, every question he had gently avoided, every rider who had searched the forests without revealing the truth. Ethan met her eyes with quiet regret. "I wanted to tell you," he said softly. "But for the first time in many years, someone looked at me without seeing a title first." Emily struggled to find words. "You are the Alpha King?" He gave a single gentle nod. "My full name is Ethan Blackwood." The name alone carried enough history to silence the world around her. Every child in the Northern Territories had grown up hearing stories about the wise Alpha King who united rival packs, protected distant villages, and ruled with fairness instead of fear. Emily had never imagined she would one day share simple meals with that man in her grandmother's forgotten cabin. The captain finally rose and stepped forward with visible relief. "The council feared the worst after your escort became separated during the storm," he explained. "The entire kingdom has been searching for you." Ethan looked toward Emily before answering. "I was never truly alone." The captain followed his gaze, finally noticing the quiet young woman standing beside the doorway. His expression softened with genuine respect. "Then we owe this lady more than words can express." Ethan nodded. Everything changed because she chose compassion when she had no reason to trust a stranger. Emily lowered her eyes, still trying to understand how the wounded traveler she had cared for had become the Alpha King everyone believed was lost. Yet as she looked back at Ethan, she realized something remarkable. Despite the revelation, his kind smile had not changed. He was still the same man who had repaired her gate, shared bread at her table, and thanked her for simple acts of kindness. Only now did she understand why quiet strength had surrounded him from the very beginning. And standing beneath the morning sun, while the royal guard waited respectfully for their king, Emily sensed that the story fate had begun writing in the northern forest was only just beginning. The journey from the forgotten cabin to the royal capital began beneath clear autumn skies. Yet Emily could not shake the feeling that she had stepped into someone else's life. She rode beside Ethan through forests, slowly giving way to open valleys where townspeople paused in their daily work as the royal escort passed. Everywhere they traveled, people bowed respectfully toward the Alpha King, but Ethan acknowledged every greeting with the same quiet kindness he had shown while splitting firewood outside her grandmother's cabin. The farther they traveled, the more Emily realized that the stories told about him had never mentioned his gentleness. By late afternoon, the towers of the capital appeared beyond the hills, their white stone walls glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Royal banners fluttered above the gates while citizens gathered along the streets, relieved to see their king return safely. As the procession entered the city, cheers echoed across the square. Emily instinctively guided her horse farther behind the royal guard, hoping to remain unnoticed. She was only a rejected Omega from a forgotten pack. She did not belong among marble buildings and royal ceremonies. Ethan noticed immediately. He slowed his horse until they rode side by side once again. "Do not fall behind," he said quietly. "You came here because of your courage, not because of anyone else's permission." His words steadied her more than he realized. Inside the palace courtyard, the royal council assembled to welcome their king home. Advisors, commanders, and respected elders filled the grand staircase, their expressions changing from relief to curiosity the moment they noticed the young woman riding beside Ethan. Whispered conversations spread through the gathering. No one recognized her name. Some remembered hearing that an unnamed Omega had been found near the northern forest, but none expected the Alpha King to escort her personally into the palace. Ethan dismounted first before turning to offer Emily his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it. Together they crossed the courtyard while hundreds of eyes followed every step. At the top of the staircase stood Lord Marcus Hawthorne, the senior royal advisor, whose silver hair and calm expression reflected decades of service. He bowed respectfully to Ethan before speaking. "Your Majesty, the kingdom rejoices at your safe return." Ethan inclined his head. The kingdom should thank someone else first. He stepped slightly aside, allowing Emily to stand beside him rather than behind him. The movement immediately silenced every whisper surrounding them. Ethan looked across the assembled council with unwavering calm. "When the storm separated me from my escort, I was injured and alone deep within the northern forest. Many searched for me afterward, but one person chose compassion before she knew who I was." Every eye turned toward Emily. She lowered her gaze, uncomfortable beneath so much attention. Ethan continued in the same steady voice. "Emily Carter found a wounded stranger, offered shelter without asking for payment, shared her food, tended my injuries, and protected my life while believing I was simply a traveler in need." A respectful silence settled across the courtyard. Lord Hawthorne studied Emily with renewed understanding before placing one hand across his chest. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "the kingdom is indebted to you." Emily blinked in surprise. She had expected questions, perhaps even suspicion, but not gratitude. Ethan looked toward the gathered nobles one final time. Some judge others by status, family, or reputation. Emily judged only by what she saw before her, someone who needed help. That is the kind of character every kingdom should honor. His words carried no anger and no accusation, only quiet truth. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. The whispers disappeared, replaced by sincere respect. Members of the royal household who moments earlier had viewed Emily as an unknown outsider now greeted her with warm smiles and graceful bows. Even the palace attendants welcomed her as an honored guest rather than a visitor passing through. Emily looked around the courtyard in quiet disbelief. Only days earlier she had stood alone beneath the blood moon, believing no one would ever choose her. Now she stood beside the Alpha King, while an entire kingdom recognized the value that had always existed within her. For the first time in many years, she no longer felt invisible. And as the afternoon sunlight bathed the palace in warm gold, she realized that true honor had arrived not because fate had changed who she was, but because kindness had finally been seen by those willing to recognize its quiet strength. Several weeks passed, and the palace gradually began to feel less like an unfamiliar world and more like a place where Emily could finally breathe without fear of being judged. She never sought attention, even after the kingdom learned the story of how she had rescued the wounded stranger in the northern forest. Instead, she spent her days tending the royal gardens, helping the palace healers prepare herbal remedies, and listening patiently to anyone who needed comfort. The servants admired her humility. The council respected her wisdom. Even children who wandered through the palace corridors smiled whenever they saw her, because she always greeted them with warmth that expected nothing in return. Ethan watched all of it with quiet admiration. He had spent years surrounded by people who respected his crown, yet Emily had reminded him that the greatest leaders were those who inspired trust through kindness rather than authority. One peaceful evening, as the first stars appeared above the palace, Ethan invited Emily to walk with him through the moon garden, a place where white flowers bloomed beneath silver lanterns and every path overlooked the northern mountains. It was the same moon that had witnessed her rejection only a short time before, yet everything about this night felt different. They stopped beside a crystal fountain where the water reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Ethan turned toward her with the same gentle smile she had first seen inside the little cabin hidden among the pines. "There is something I have wanted to tell you since the day we met," he said softly. Emily looked at him with quiet curiosity. Ethan continued, "When you found me in the forest, I believed I had lost more than my way. I had begun to lose faith that people could still choose compassion without expecting anything in return. You changed that." Emily lowered her eyes, touched by the sincerity in his voice. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me." Ethan smiled gently. "That is exactly why it mattered." A soft breeze carried the fragrance of blooming jasmine through the garden as moonlight settled across the marble paths. Ethan reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully removed a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon surrounded by delicate leaves. It was beautifully crafted, simple rather than extravagant. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She believed that true strength could always recognize another kind heart. I would be honored if you accepted it." Emily accepted the pendant with trembling hands, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. She understood that the gift represented far more than precious silver. It was a promise of trust, gratitude, and a future built on mutual respect. Ethan gently took her hand. "Emily Carter, you never asked for a crown. You never searched for power. You simply chose kindness when no one was watching. That is why I hope you will stand beside me, not because destiny demands it, but because my heart does." Tears of happiness gathered in Emily's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart." News of their engagement spread across the kingdom, bringing celebration instead of surprise. The people had already witnessed the respect Ethan showed her, and they understood that their future queen had earned every honor through compassion rather than privilege. On the day of the ceremony, representatives from every pack gathered beneath the open sky. There were no grand displays meant to impress the crowd, only heartfelt promises shared before family, friends, and the people they had pledged to serve. As Ethan and Emily stood together beneath the full moon, he spoke words that would be remembered throughout the kingdom for generations. "A crown does not make a person worthy. Kindness does." Those simple words echoed across the silent gathering before applause rose like a warm wave through the valley. Emily looked toward the distant northern forest where her journey had begun. She remembered the lonely path, the forgotten cabin, and the wounded wolf whose life she had chosen to save without knowing his name. She finally understood that the greatest moments in life often began with the smallest acts of compassion. From that day forward, the Alpha King and the once rejected Omega ruled side by side with humility, fairness, and hope, reminding every child, every traveler, and every lonely soul who heard their story that true strength is gentle, that love can redeem even the deepest sorrow, and that a single act of kindness can change not only one life, but the future of an entire kingdom.